Comics. Comics.
Welcome to this episode of RRP. Now, for most episodes of the show, we like to talk about major franchises. But since we've done quite a few of those and they've been really long episodes, this episode will be a bit shorter. So this time, I want to turn our attention to something that's maybe not as well known, but that is still worth discussing. Recently, Mike and I were talking about fantasy films, and that led me to 2011's Season of the Witch, starring Nicolas Cage and Ron Perlman. This is not the same film as Halloween 3, to make it absolutely clear. Even though this film has the trappings of a horror movie set during the Black Plague, Season of the Witch surprisingly does have its share of fantasy elements too. But we will get into that in a little bit. So, Mike, do you have any opening thoughts about this film?
I suppose the thing that jumps out at me is the actions of the church as portrayed in Season of the Witch. It is the same kind of stuff that led to the creation of the Gallows Men from Omen Comics. The whole creation process there was me wondering what it would be like to be one of the church's or the state's executioners. As Bayman said, the church could be very persuasive. They often tortured people until they confessed to a crime that they started out being guilty of. Whether it was true or not didn't matter. Only that they confessed. What must it have been like to carry out those orders? To believe in your heart that the person you're torturing is innocent, but going through it for fear of eternal damnation. Granted, I was talking about the Inquisition and the witch trials, but Crusades are certainly a part of what I'm talking about as part of the theme for the Season of the Witch story. This movie shows what people are willing to do to avoid damnation of the church, and worse, what excuses people are willing to make to do horrible things. Anyway, imagining all of that led me to creating this group of executioners that revolted and stood against the crimes of the church and state.
I can totally see how an organization like the Gallows Men might have come about in that light. I mean, we've definitely not shied away from the problems with religion in our Omenverse books for sure. The Straight Razor Killer coming immediately to mind on my side. But like this movie, we also draw a distinction between the church and those who believe in their God. Not everyone uses faith to justify terrible deeds. Still, because we're talking about the Crusades in medieval Europe, it's important to discuss these kinds of issues honestly. Believe it or not, though, I first watched Season of the Witch in the theater on its original release date. It looked like an interesting film and a different kind of film for Nicolas Cage. But by the end of the movie, I was finally sold on it. And it is one of those films that I think has gone underappreciated even all these years. But I think there's some cult classic potential with this movie as well. And we'll talk a little bit about why that is.
I'm not quite sure we're on the same page with this one, but we will get more into that later, as you said. For now, let's move on to the writing process for Season of the Witch, Steve.
Sure, and I'll preface what you're saying with the point that I think this may be an episode where contrasting points of view will create a clearer picture of this film. I personally enjoy this film quite a lot, but I'll be the first to admit that I might not be seeing it clearly because of that. So I think a counterpoint will definitely be useful here. But as you say, let's get into the background of this film. Season of the Witch began as a spec script by a writer named Bragi F. Schutt in year 2000. The script made the rounds with a number of studios who made bids to acquire the script. MGM won the bidding war for the script, with producers Charles Roven and Alex Gartner involved. However, they couldn't get the film produced, and in 2004, problems with MGM led to the script being picked up by Columbia Pictures. It also turns out that Season of the Witch was inspired by Ingmar Bergman's The Seventh Seal from 1957. I honestly didn't make that connection the first time I saw this movie, but thinking about it, it does make perfect sense. So let me talk about the similarities between the two films because they are intriguing. The Seventh Seal is the story of Antonius Block, a Crusader knight who returns to Europe only to see plague and death everywhere. The relationship between Block and his squire echoes the one between the two main heroes of Season of the Witch. Like Behmen von Bleibruck in this movie, Block from Seventh Seal is a philosopher as well as a warrior, and he's always questioning God and whether what he's doing is right. Block's squire, like Felsen in this film, is a cynic who is a counterpoint to Behemon's broken idealism. Both movies are heavily critical of the Crusades and religious extremism, though this is done in different ways. Both films deal with supernatural elements, also in different ways. With The Seventh Seal, Block plays chess with death, while Season of the Witch deals with witches and demons. Block in Seventh Seal encounters a woman who is accused of consorting with the devil and causing the plague, much as Bayman does with Anna in Season of the Witch. Also, both deal with the heroes facing their own deaths by the end of the film after finding an answer to their respective doubts. So I don't think there's much question that Season of the Witch took influence from The Seventh Seal. I do want to emphasize, though, that these films go in very different directions, even though The Seventh Seal was obviously a strong influence. The Seventh Seal deals with a knight that has lost his faith in God and who's trying to find something to validate his faith. Bayman still believes in God, but he's lost faith in the church and he's racked by guilt for the sins he's committed in God's name. Furthermore, The Seventh Seal deals with themes of death and despair, and themes that I suspect probably come from German philosophy, such as the God is dead angle from Nietzsche. Season of the Witch goes into some dark places, but it doesn't wallow in hopelessness, faithlessness, or existentialism. It deals more with the darkness in the human soul and what it takes to overcome that. Also, as a side note, it may have been the similarities to The Seventh Seal that attracted the interest of Nicolas Cage. Cage is extremely knowledgeable about film history, and he would have probably seen the connections, but we'll get into that in a little bit. I'll also add one other thing before we move on. The Seventh Seal opens with a biblical reference from Revelation 8:1. Quote, when the Lamb opened the seventh seal, there was silence in heaven for about half an hour, unquote. This is where the movie gets its name from. But Season of the Witch also makes a reference to Revelation, probably a nod to the seventh seal. Mike, did you want to talk about how that fits in?
I do, but something just occurred to me as you read that. That particular passage from Revelation 8:1 is when John is interpreting the revelation as it's being given to him, and suddenly heaven is just silent for about a half an hour, and that seems to fit with the theme you're talking about there in the seventh seal, like probably when he was playing chess with death, that kind of a thing.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Right. But anyway, but first, I have to say that the similarities between Season of the Witch and the Seventh Seal are pretty obvious from how you laid it out there. And I'm almost certain that the connection would have been seen by Cage from what you described. But on to the biblical reference in Season of the Witch. The forest that the group travels through is called Wormwood, and that was rather interesting choice. It takes its name from Revelation 8:10-11, which says the third angel sounded its trumpet. A great star, blazing like a torch, fell from the sky on a third of the rivers and the springs of water. The name of the star is Wormwood, also translated as bitterness. A third of the waters turned bitter, and many people died from the waters that had become bitter. I should point out that this passage refers to the judgments God will pour out onto the earth during the Great Tribulation, which is the end times event as far as the world we know it is goes. So many believe that the Black Death was in fact a sign that the world was coming to an end. So to look at the plague as one of the trumpets makes a lot of sense. Plus, while it would not be accurate biblically speaking, I think the writer was trying to imply that they forestalled the apocalypse, and that third trumpet had perhaps been sounded already. You'll notice that when Felsen tried the food in the pot, which was often just vegetables and water back then, at the plague-ridden house that they burned, the water in the pot had turned so bitter that even the smell of it was pungent. So the name really fits both thematically and in the story, even if it does not directly claim it like that.
I think that's very likely the way that the writer intended it. And on top of that, I would say that one of the four horsemen of the apocalypse is pestilence. Just throwing that out there. The connections with the seventh seal and the wormwood references indicate that it was set up, though, as a deliberate reference. There are definite apocalyptic elements to this movie, which fits with the reference to the plague in both films. So Bayman and his party have to travel through the forest that represents bitterness. It's an interesting reference, and that is also a subtle callback to the film that inspired it. But why don't we get into how the film was made, Mike?
Sure, Steve, but I I have to talk about something you said there. Are you saying that their going through the forest was meant to be symbolic of having gone through the third trumpet? Because if you are, that would be interesting considering the fourth trumpet. Check out Revelation 8:12-13. The fourth angel sounded his trumpet, and a third of the sun was struck, a third of the moon, and a third of the stars, so that a third of them was turned dark. A third of the day was without light, and also a third of the night. As I watched, I heard an eagle that was flying in midair call out in a loud voice, "Woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth, because of the trumpet blasts that are about to be sounded by the other three angels." I can't help but think about how darkness was spreading out like a storm over the monastery when the demon actually took form. I mean, granted, it's not exactly like what is described in the Bible, but if we're talking about apocalyptic themes here, I can't help but think that was at least a nod to the fourth trumpet and the forestalling of the final three trumpets. What do you think of that, Steve?
While I'm not deeply as immersed into Revelation as you are, Mike, I think that interpretation could be what they're aiming for. The seventh seal clearly refers to the seven trumpets in the opening sequence, and this movie is making intentional references to that film. And as you say, there are clear apocalyptic signs that we see in this movie. I don't think that that's incidental or accidental. But why don't we get into how they brought that vision to life, starting with who they brought in to do it?
That sounds like a good idea. Columbia Pictures had brought on Dominic Senna and scouted some locations, but never went into production. So the project eventually moved over to Relativity Media and Atlas Productions, and Senna was officially attached to direct, even with the switchover. Season of the Witch was actually Relativity Media's first in-house production. The film had a budget of approximately $40 million, and much of the budget was covered by Relativity with pre-sales to distributors outside of the United States. Business and creative discussions led to avoiding too much violence or gore in the film so as to reach a broader audience. But honestly, it's a horror movie, folks. You're going to have to get over that. Nicolas Cage was considered for the starring role of Bayman, but was unavailable during the time of the location shooting. Cage eventually became available in 2008, right after he had finished working on Bad Lieutenant Port of Call, New Orleans, and was cast in the role. Filming took place in Austria, Hungary, and Croatia. In fact, most of the principal photography took place in practical locations, but there were several days committed to filming on green screen, particularly the scenes that were filmed in Berg Krusenstein and the Loser Mountain. Principal photography was completed in April of 2009, but the cast and crew regathered a few months later to film additional battle sequences, filming on green screen to save on travel. But that would not be the end of principal photography. The studio was not impressed with the screening, and reshoots had to be made. Reshoots were held in September of 2010 and were directed in part by Dominic Senna. However, extensive uncredited reshoots were done by director Brett Ratner, who brought on his regular editor Mark Helfrich with him to not only edit his reshoots but to tighten up the rest of the movie.
While I'm generally favorable towards this film, I do have to criticize some of the photography. The green screening and the CGI are probably the worst parts of the movie on a visual level, and you especially see some of that towards the end. In contrast, the best parts of the movie are where they filmed in Eastern Europe and focused on practical locations and practical effects. I also can't help but wonder if there might have been too many cooks involved in making the broth on this one, with bringing in Ratner and Helfrich to do the reshoots and the additional edits. But let's move on and talk about the star of this film.
Let's do that. But I have to agree fully with you about the practical locations and CGI in general for the film. It really took me out of the story, especially towards the end, like you said. But also, as you said, let's move on to the casting. And who better to start with than the star of the film? Nicolas Cage, who had to learn both horseback riding and sword fighting for the role of Bayman, had worked with director Dominic Senna in Gone in 60 Seconds from 2000, which was awesome, by the way, and with producer Charles Roven in City of Angels from 1998, which was also good, but so heartbreakingly sad that it ruins the movie. Cage was also interested in the film's fantastical subject matter, having recently starred in The Sorcerer's Apprentice from 2010. He also described Bayman as the first conscientious objector, saying, "I admired the idea of him breaking from whatever religious propaganda was forced upon him and still finding an even closer connection with his faith and with God. Those iconoclastic elements into the character made him very interesting to me." But I believe there was another reason that Nicolas Cage was interested in the role that you wanted to get into, wasn't there, Steve?
Indeed, I do. As I mentioned earlier, Cage is a huge cinephile, and he's extremely knowledgeable about film history. At least some of that comes from being a member of the Coppola family. Nicolas Cage is the nephew of acclaimed director Francis Ford Coppola, and Cage's father was a professor of literature, so he grew up around classic film. Cage is admitted to being a huge fan of German expressionist films like The Seventh Seal. If you look at some of his performances, you can definitely see moments where he acts like a German expressionist actor. In a 2007 interview with The Guardian, Cage said, quote, I was watching movies like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and Nosferatu and Fellini's Juliet of the Spirits when I was 5 years old. My father had this little projector and he played it in the house and we'd all watch. And I'd have nightmares, just nightmares. But then I grew to love it. I said, okay, can I do that today? If you look at Vampire's Kiss, it's all about that memory of Nosferatu, that Germanic expressionistic acting style, unquote. So even though what Cage does appears crazy and over the top, and he gets memed constantly for it, there is a method to his madness. I think Nicolas Cage knows exactly what he's doing with his performances. You can definitely see the Nosferatu influence when he plays vampires, for example, and you can definitely see it in his Dracula in the recent Renfield movie. My guess is he probably saw the German expressionist influence in the script, saw the similarities to the Seventh Seal, and Cage decided that he wanted to do his own take on that. But here's the thing I find interesting about Cage's performance as Behmen von Bleibruck. In this movie, he doesn't do any of the over-top crazy stuff that you see in The Wicker Man or Face Off or anything like that. His performance is sober, thoughtful, and he's playing a serious character. And that's probably because he's leaning into Max von Sydow in The Seventh Seal, where he's more of a somber and philosophical character who's dealing with a crisis of faith. But I think this is one of my favorite Cage performances, just because it shows he can do a strong, subdued performance without doing any of the exaggerated antics that he's known for. Beast, not the beast. but the connection to the Seventh Seal explains a lot about why Cage took this role and why he plays it the way he does.
Sorry, you got me with that one. That is certainly true. Behmen does come across as very contemplative, and he always seems to be weighing heavy issues to find their balance. And so I could certainly see the somber philosopher there. But I believe there was even more to the film that drew Cage to the role, wasn't there, Steve?
There was indeed. The other angle with Cage's involvement in the film is that he wanted to do a film in the spirit of Roger Corman's horror films. Cage had this to say about the Corman connection. Quote, I wanted to make movies that celebrated actors like Christopher Lee and Vincent Price and the great Roger Corman classics that are unafraid to explore the paranormal and the supernatural, unquote. The really interesting thing about this is that Sir Christopher Lee actually is in this movie, although in a small role. Lee plays the cardinal that recruits Behmen for the mission, though he's in some heavy plague makeup, and it's hard to know that it's him if not for the voice. So that's probably also factored into Cage's decision to accept the role.
Oh man, someone like Nicolas Cage, who is such a Corman fan, and it sounds like a Hammer horror fan too, must have been geeking out to work with Sir Christopher Lee. That kind of thing must have been a dream of his. At least I imagine I would likely be geeking out if I was a huge Hammer and Corman fan. But let's continue with the casting. Ron Perlman was brought on to play Behmen's companion Felsen. When asked about choosing the role, Perlman said, "I love the character. I'm actually more comfortable being a sidekick because I don't get blamed if it's a complete disaster." I really liked his mindset. I liked his irreverence. In a world of seriousness, he's a guy who thinks it's all bullshit. He's just in it for the whores and the sword fights. When asked about Felsen's religion, Perlman said, whereas Behmen has a very well-articulated idea of his relationship to country and church and spirituality and God, Felsen has none. He doesn't bother to spend any time thinking about that. Honestly, I see Perlman's concept of his character and Cage's concept of his character played out really well in the scene where they are put in the dungeon. Behmen has just said out loud for the first time that he serves the church no more. You can see how the weight of his own words are weighing heavily on him as he sits down. When Felsen makes light of the statement by saying the priest looked like Behmen had just pissed in his holy water, this perfectly shows his irreverence. And when they both laugh, you see why they are both friends beyond the bonds of war.
Absolutely, and those are the moments where Behmen's and Felsen's friendship feels believable to me. I mean, Felsen never cared about the church, and he's well aware of the garbage that the priests have been feeding him, but he's going to support Behmen no matter what because they shed blood together. But he's also not going to let Behmen wallow in misery either. And Felsen does this by brilliantly taking the piss and making light of the whole thing. So, digging a little deeper, Felsen's character is based noticeably on the squire of Antonius Block, but I think he grows into a very distinct character. Felsen is in some ways kind of like the Conan of the movie. He's a fighter who's in it for the thrill of it, as well as the beer and the women. But despite that, he's extremely loyal to Behmen, and that friendship is a big part of the movie. Anyway, I just can't imagine anybody but Ron Perlman in that role, just like with Hellboy. The sense of brotherhood between Felsen and Behmen comes across perfectly, and I think Cage and Perlman have really good chemistry together. They're good foils, but you also get why they're friends. I mean, they're old soldiers who have fought together for years, and that binds them together. It's much like we talked about with Riggs and Murtaugh in the Lethal Weapon episode. They alone can only relate to the experiences that they both lived through. It's just that Felsen deals with it by living in the moment, getting what he can from life, and just not worrying about the past or what the future might bring. He just feels no pain whatsoever. Not to mention that Felsen is just a lot of fun to watch in general. But let's get into the casting of the witch of the movie, Mike. This was Claire Foy's first feature film. Am I right?
It was actually. Claire Foy had previously worked on the British miniseries Little Dorrit in the titular role, but actually made her feature film debut as the young woman who is accused of being a witch. It should be noted that while the unpossessed version of her character reveals that her name is, in fact, Anna at the end of the movie, in the credits she is simply listed as the girl. Claire Foy met Senna seeking out the role, explaining that it's quite a manipulative role. The character does a lot of manipulating, pitting other people against each other, being quite mischievous. That was something I thought would obviously be good to do. To prepare for the role, Foy researched both witchcraft and demonic possession. She's described its appeal by saying playing a character that was making things happen and mainly in control of an entire group of men. And for once, be the character that is completely in the know about everything. There is nothing that she doesn't know. Nothing is a surprise. And she's able to deal with every single situation that arises the way that she sees fit. And I think that was quite refreshing to be able to play a character that was not entirely beholden to everyone else. I'm going to pretend like her answers didn't set off any red flags for me at all and say that I was actually more impressed with Foy's performance than I was with anyone else's in the film. And that actually includes Perlman and Cage. But now that we have casting out of the way, I understand you have a story synopsis for us, Steve.
I do, but before I get into that, I will say that they got really lucky in casting a top actress at the right point in her career. Because I agree that Claire Foy is really good in this, and I think she definitely gets the manipulative nature of that character. You never quite know where she really stands through most of the film, and a lot of that is in her performance. So let's get into the plot of the film before we dig too deeply into what happens. Season of the Witch is set in the Middle Ages during the background of the Crusades and the Black Plague. The film opens with a group of women who are accused of being witches, and they are forced to either confess their sins or be killed. Ultimately, it turns out that they're all killed anyway. A single priest remains behind to perform the rites to keep the dead in their graves, and he's able to do it for one of the witches, but then another body comes to life and kills the priest. The action then turns to a pair of Crusader knights named Bayman of Blybrook and Felsen. We see a montage of Bayman and Felsen fighting through different battles in the Crusades and how Bayman changes. And we see that he starts as an idealistic knight who he believes he's fighting for God, but then he starts questioning what he does the more battles that he fights. Then we see Bayman realize that they're killing women and children, and he finally confronts the priest who's in charge of the operation. Bayman and Felsen decide to desert in violation of their oaths and head back to Europe. Along the way, the knights stumble upon a farmhouse where the family have all died from the plague. After this, they head to the town for information, only to end up being exposed as deserters. So Bayman and Felsen are held prisoner, and they're ultimately brought before the local cardinal, played by the great Sir Christopher Lee. The cardinal offers a deal to the knights. If they escort an accused witch to the monastery in Severac, they will be pardoned for desertion and set free. The witch is accused of starting this pestilence, and they think that by sending her to the monks, the curse that can be ended in the plague will stop. Initially, Bayman refuses to help, seeing himself as a servant of God and not the church, and the knights are sent back to prison. But after meeting the witch, Bayman reconsiders and accepts the offer, feeling that the girl deserves a fair trial and that his duty is to ensure that she gets one. So Bayman and Felsen set out with a small group to Severac, heading out with a prison wagon. The party includes a priest named Belzac, a local knight named Sir Eckhart, and a convicted swindler named Hagamar, who serves as the guide to the monastery. While along the path, they run into a squire named Kay, who follows the group in the hopes of becoming a knight. After a duel with Felsen, Bayman accepts Kay as the squire, and then Kay officially becomes part of the group. Along the way to the monastery, strange things start happening, and it's clear that the witch is manipulating things somehow. She overhears Eckhart talking about his daughter, and then Eckhart is lured away from the group by the sound of his daughter's voice. Eckhart ends up accidentally killing himself by impaling himself through Kai's sword, presumably the result of an illusion. I guess Eckhart wasn't thinking about the future. After this, de realizes that the witch is exploiting the group's weaknesses, and they agree to be more careful around her. But eventually, the group reaches a rickety old bridge, which nearly collapses as they try to cross it with the wagon. The witch saves Kai's life when he's about to fall, and they continue. Along the way, the witch continues to take advantage of Bayman's guilt issues. He has nightmares about what he did in the Crusades, and he just can't let go of them. Following this, the group gets attacked by a pack of wolves, probably because of the witch's influence, and Hagamar gets killed as well. The survivors get through the wolf attack, and they finally reach the monastery at Severac. However, when they get to the monastery, they realize that all the monks are dead except for a single survivor who lives just long enough to point to the book in his hands, and that turns out to be the Book of Solomon. After some poking around the monastery, de Belzac and Bayman realize that the girl isn't really a witch at all. She's been possessed by a demon the entire time. So de Belzac performs an exorcism, driving out the demon, and then it gets worse, as this was all part of the demon's plan the entire time. The demon wanted to be taken to Severac so that he could kill the priest and destroy all remaining copies of the Book of Solomon. So Kay is knighted by Bayman, who doesn't anticipate surviving the rest of the battle. The knights plan on using a ritual from the book to banish the demon, but it's a ritual that takes time to complete. So this leads to a huge fight between the remaining knights and the demon. De Belzac is killed during the battle, leaving Kai to complete the ritual. This leaves Felsen and Bayman to fight the demon as Kai recites the ritual. So Felsen gets in an awesome last fight against the demon before he's consumed by demonic flame. Bayman also gets in his own heroic sacrifice, and he dies honorably. And this gives Kai time to complete the ritual, and the demon is sent back to hell. The movie ends on the gravesite of the fallen knights. The witch was not a witch at all, but a formerly possessed woman named Anna. So Kai and Anna pay their respects to Bayman, and the movie comes to an end.
Wow. That was a pretty good story synopsis. So I do not have much to add there, really. But so what do you say we move on to actually discussing the film itself, Steve?
Sure. This movie has the trappings of a historical film, and it is in many ways a horror film as well. But as I was watching the movie for the first time, I realized that the group we're following is your archetypal adventuring party. Bayman is your classical paladin. I mean, even if he no longer serves the church. I mean, he certainly has the values of a paladin, following his own code of honor. Felsen is an old school fighter in many ways, and he's in it for a good fight and simple pleasures. Eckhart is another fighter type as well, but you also have de Belzac, who is in the traditional cleric role, as well as Hagamar, who's very much your standard rogue. You could even argue that Anna is a spellcaster, and although she's called a witch, she's probably closer to a warlock in D&D terms. But I think the reason I keep coming back to this movie is because this group identifies so well with a standard adventuring party. Are you seeing anything like that as well, or am I overreaching with this?
No, I don't think you're reaching with that at all. In fact, when you mentioned to me before we did this episode about this being a fantasy story, having that adventuring party element to it is about the only connection I can make with that, really. I very much took this as a horror story set in the time of the Black Death. But having that adventuring party thing going on sets Season of the Witch apart from other horror films. And the horror element seemed to set it apart from your average fantasy movie. I seem to recall reading that the Black Death was the result of God's judgments on the earth, but I do not know of any story where the bubonic plague was actually caused by a demon lord. So I think that makes Season of the Witch stand out even among movies about it. But I believe you had something else to point out about the film's representation of a certain institution, didn't you?
I do. One point about the film that comes back often is the criticism of the medieval Catholic Church. I don't think that this movie is critical of religion per se, it must be said. Bayman draws a clear distinction between serving God and serving the church. Also, de Belzac is portrayed as a positive example of a priest in this film. So I don't think this movie is anti-religious, but this movie condemns many things the church historically did, including the religious wars and the unfair treatment of accused witches. So let me throw this over to you, Mike. How accurate do you think the movie is, and how well do you think the movie tackled those issues?
Well, I will answer that, but first, I'd like to say that I think that the thing that that this movie does specifically is draw a distinction between God and man. That God Himself might be holy, but maybe all of His followers might not be. So, as opposed to being anti church, it's more like anti the corruption of man, kind of a thing.
Right.
But I suppose I should start off by saying I don't believe this movie was intended to be accurate to the letter. But that said, I know a bit about witch trials, and I think this film gets that fairly close. For instance, I'm reminded of the vampire witch hysteria that swept across Romania and other parts of Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries that we talked about in our vampires and werewolves episode. I was particularly reminded of this by how they are hanging, then drowning the witches, and the priest wants to speak the right words over them so that they do not rise again. That is very reminiscent of the types of practices that we talked about in regards to how vampires and witches are dealt with, although scaled back quite a bit. Plus, the story Anna told about the woman in her village being accused of witchcraft is actually a practice that was held. When a confession could not be attained by the church, they would often resort to tests like weighing someone down with so much weight that they could not possibly swim and then throwing them in a lake or a river. If they survived, they would be found guilty of witchcraft because they must have used their magic to float in the water. If they died, well, the church was wrong, no harm, no foul. In fact, the church was known to charge the accused witch's family for any expenses accrued in their family member's execution, like having to pay for the wood that was used to burn them, for instance. Also, Anna would have been tortured until she confessed, and they did show that was at least going on to some degree. I think the thing I'm not really sure about is why the thought of possession never came up beforehand. As far as demon possession goes, they seem to have pulled Anna's experience right from Legions in Mark 5, 1 through 20. You'll note that with the demon in her, Anna is stronger than she looks and could not be contained unless she allowed it. Legion was bound many times, but always escaped, even breaking through chains. She was also driven into a solitary places, which is where the priests say they found her. So too was Legion, only he hung out among the tombs. I also make the Legion comparison because whoever that demon was, they were clearly in authority in hell and had command over possibly a legion or more of demons. Another thing to consider specifically about the church is that the world definitely felt as though it was being judged. The Great Famine had happened in 1315 to 1317 and had killed an estimated 30 to 60% of the European population and about a third of the Middle East. Those lucky enough to survive the Great Famine faced the Black Death, which spread across Western Eurasia and North Africa from 1346 to 1353, causing the deaths of 70 to 200 million people. All of that to say that people feeling as though God had abandoned them and was pouring out his judgments on the earth was an understandable perspective. Under that kind of reality, I can see why the church got so desperate, and that might explain some of their more extreme reactions in the film. I'm not in any way justifying their actions, particularly as it pertains to witches and the Crusades, but I think that this movie portrays the severity of the situation enough that it explains why things were a bit different during that time.
That sounds reasonable to me, and that's a pretty good summation of the facts behind it. I don't expect perfect historical accuracy in a film like this. It should be said. My standard is usually whether or not what we see is reasonable enough, or if there are any glaring inaccuracies that might take me out of the film. Obviously, the demonic elements are made up, but the way the Crusades and the Black Death are portrayed work well enough as a backdrop for the story in the film. But you're right about how people would have thought that God had abandoned them, given the loss and death they would have faced on a daily basis at that time. Similarly, Bayman spends a good part of the film struggling with faith, but he's also struggling with his own guilt or having killed so many people during the Crusades. What I find interesting about that is that Bayman initially makes the wrong decision because of his distrust of the church, though he walks it back later once he talks with Anna for the first time. Eventually, he ends up finding his faith and dies opposing the true enemy of God rather than just the enemies of the church. So the Bayman gets a pretty solid character arc here. And what I love is the way Nick Cage plays it. It's a somber portrayal, not at all like the crazy stuff that he does in his other films, as we mentioned. But did you have any thoughts on Bayman, Mike?
You covered a fair amount of it, but I will add that Bayman killed a young girl while fighting in the Crusades, and that was the moment that his epiphany came to him. He finally saw that he was not, in fact, serving God by serving the church. I think that he desperately wanted an act that could redeem him for taking that girl's life, and that saving Anna by defeating that demon gave him that redemption. And that is why his last wish was that Kay take care of her.
I'm glad that you mentioned the Turkish girl because she's the catalyst that makes Bayman turn away from the church. I think you hit on a really good point here that Bayman is hoping that by saving a life, he might in some way make up for killing that girl. Felsen even confronts him on this at one point, as I recall. And I think Bayman gives him an honest answer, even if he may not be completely honest with himself. Speaking of Felsen, I have to admit that he is my favorite thing in this movie. I don't know how much is the character and how much of it is Ron Perlman being a badass in this movie. I mean, he doesn't get much real character growth in this movie, not really, but Felsen is fun to watch at every scene he's in, and he goes out in a literal blaze of glory. Mike, did you have a particular standout character in this film that you wanted to talk about?
Huh. I guess the real standout character for me was the demon itself, mostly because of the performance by Claire Foy, but also because while that character was clearly a demon lord, he is out there doing his own dirty work. I have seen many demons be deceptive, but the purpose of their deceptions is to cause confusion and chaos. Satan is the father of lies, for instance. But this lie, this deception about being a witch had a long-term goal in mind that required her to make such a deception. I guess I just have not seen a lot of demons with that level of skill and tactics.
That actually makes sense to me, and I completely see your point on the way the demon is written. My only real criticism about the demon is that the CGI on the demon wasn't that great when we see his true form. But when Foy is acting possessed, the demon gets really menacing and even threatening at times. And I agree with you that the manipulative nature is handled well. The demon puts some real thoughts into his deceptions. I mean, he usually leads people on with just enough truth to play into his hands, or he'll play on the vulnerabilities of his enemies to lead them to their doom. But speaking of that, let's talk about what happened to Eckhart. I can't help but feel bad for this guy. I mean, he loses his daughter, and then that pain leads to him being tragically killed. I do like that they played coy about whether or not what he saw was really happened or not, and whether it's a demon messing with his mind.
They definitely made it seem as if whether it was intentional or not, if the demon learns even one thing from a person, he can see into them fully simply by his confession to others that he had to bury his daughter and that Anna looked like her, allowed Anna to see into him enough to pull his daughter's voice out of his memory. Also, you'll note that what connection she established with Bayman allowed her to repeat the words of the church's representative back in the Crusades. But I also have another theory that I want that what was going on there that I'd like to bounce off of you. They talk about they talk about how many men have gone into Wormwood and were never heard from again. I can't help but be reminded of Middle Earth's Mirkwood that fell under the shadow of Sauron. I don't know about you, but it felt like a shadow had definitely fallen over Wormwood in the movie. There was a darkness there and something supernatural about it. Anyway, all of that to say, I think that the demon used the dark magic of the woods to help confuse Eckhart and cause him to see his daughter. But I mean, what do you think of that?
I'm not sure how intentional it was, but I think the parallels are intriguing for sure. I mean, evil forests have been around a long time, even before Tolkien and into the classic fairy tales. It's an old fantasy trope that you see a lot, but I do like the connection to The Hobbit there, and I can see some definite validity to the comparison. And much like The Hobbit, the group has to pass through a dark forest on a journey to stop a powerful monster. But where I think the season of the witch gets interesting with it is that the darkness of the forest is internal and not purely external. The heroes all have to confront their inner demons before they can fight the external one. But speaking of demons, let's turn our attention to the film's big twist. I have two minds on it. One is that I get the impression that there was a rewrite of the third act because I'm not sure this was the original plan. It feels very different in tone and in the action from the first two-thirds of the film. Of course, that could be the reshoots and by Ratner as well. At the same time, I like the idea of suggesting the idea of witchcraft, only for the girl to turn out to be possessed by a demon. I feel like it explains what's going on during the journey. The demon is trying to mess with the party, and he's trying to gradually eliminate them so that the survivors are easier to pick off once they arrive. I mean, it even explains why the demon tries to save Kai. He doesn't want them all to die, and the demon sees Kai as easier to manipulate. But what's your take on it, Mike?
Well, I totally see what you're saying there, but I think I had a different take. It seems to me that his whole purpose was destroying all the copies of the Book of Solomon. The only times he seems to kill is when someone gets in the way of getting to the monastery, because he knows that is where the last copies of the book are. Hagamar suggested that they kill her, and he was ripped to shreds by wolves. Eckhart said that he was going to stop her from being taken to the monastery to protect her, and that's when she killed him. Even at the beginning, when he was hung and drowned, he does not kill the priest until he hears the words of the book. In fact, I think that was when the demon's journey to the monastery began. He knew that the book had to be destroyed for hell, or perdition, as they call it, and he took the mission upon himself. I think I picked up a certain cockiness from the demon, and I personally believe that he did not think that he would have any issues taking them out once he got to the monastery. But I do agree about rescuing Kay because he is easily manipulated.
Well, pride is definitely often a fatal flaw of these demons, but I agree that Kai being easy to manipulate was large part of the reason why he was saved. Kai is an idealist and an innocent, and the demon confuses this with weakness. This is one of the problems with that kind of evil. It just can't comprehend the strength of character it takes to commit to the path of goodness and light, especially the virtue required of a true knight like Kai is. But the demon also provided the test of character for Kai to prove his worth as a knight, not realizing that he had it within himself to pass that test. So by the end of the movie, he's truly earned his newly minted knighthood. But let's talk about another thing that surprised me with this film. I think what surprised me about the most is the reception. My understanding is that the movie wasn't well received, and to be honest, I don't understand why. Maybe you can help explain it to me. But before we can get into that, why don't you talk about the reception of the film and how well it finally did?
Sure. Season of the Witch received mostly negative reviews. The general consensus from Rotten Tomatoes is that Season of the Witch is slow, cheap looking, and dull. Season of the Witch fails even as an unintentional comedy. I'm not sure I agree with that, but Associated Press film critic Christy Lemire called Season of the Witch a supernatural action thriller that is never actually thrilling, and added that the scenery is drab, the battles are interchangeable, and no one seems particularly interested in being there. The LA Times critic said that Cage was the primary reason that this sword and sorceries romp was a colossal waste of time. Tom Huddleston of Time Out London wrote, despite its admirably straight face, Season of the Witch is a silly romp with Pythonesque medieval cliche and a knockabout hammer horror with a dash of cut-price Tolkien chucked in to keep things moving. Huddleston criticized Cage's performance, but praised Perlman's. The critic concluded Season of the Witch is not for everyone. It's creaky, predictable, and frequently idiotic. But for a tipsy Saturday night, this should tick all the right boxes. However, Season of the Witch grossed $24.8 million in the United States and Canada and $66.8 million in other territories for a worldwide total of $91.6 million. So it did make money, but only when the international totals were added in. The movie would have lost $50 million based on just the US and Canada.
Definitely a lukewarm reception at best, then, and that's leaving out the critical response. Not as terrible as the reviews would suggest, but it seems like maybe the international audience embraced it more than the Western audience did, which is interesting. But I think you had something else you wanted to add, Mike?
I do. As for why it might not have done well, I can only speak for myself. But I have to say that I was generally unimpressed with Season of the Witch, although there were some good things about it, as I mentioned. I honestly think this was Perlman's and Cage's worst performances, so I think this one just landed differently for me. I honestly gave it my best shot, but I think I'm with the reviewers on this one, unfortunately. But that having been said, I'm glad that I watched it, and I do appreciate those elements that I mentioned.
That's cool. It's interesting that we disagree on this film, even though we both gleaned some good insights on it. But really, I think it's a good teachable moment for our listeners. We're not always going to agree on every film, though we very often meet in the middle. But yours is absolutely a fair take. And this is why I think sometimes it's important to have that opposing point of view, because it could just be that, as the reviewer notes, the movie isn't for everyone. And in this case, I was the target audience for the movie and you weren't. And that's absolutely fine. For example, Joker is an instance where you clearly were more the target audience for the film than I was.
Mm-hmm.
So every so often that's going to happen, and it might be the truth lies in the middle somewhere. But I'm fine with leaving that for our listeners to decide.
I totally agree with all of that. And we do end up agreeing most of the time. But like we talk about with the Skyfall song in our James Bond episode with music, so too are movies completely subjective. My not liking this movie does not make it a bad film. Like Steve said, it just wasn't for me. But it is pretty cool that we both got something out of it, even though one of us liked it and one of us did not. So perhaps that in itself says something about the quality of the film. But I believe you had another theory about why Season of the Witch might not have done so well, didn't you, Steve?
I do have something to add there. Not a theory exactly, just something that may have contributed to the US and Canadian release underperforming. I will point out one other factor, and that is the release date probably hurt the movie. This movie was pushed from an October release to a March release, and then it was moved back to January the 7th. The fact that it was moved to January tells me that the studio didn't have much confidence in the film by that point, and that proved to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. January and February films tend traditionally not to do well, and that time is generally regarded as the time of year where movies go to die. That could not have helped the movie at all.
I honestly didn't know that thing about January and February movies not doing well, but I'm sure that didn't help things at all. And I think it shows how little the faith the studio had in the project if they decided to release the movie during that time period.
That seems extremely likely. But anyway, that concludes our discussion on Season of the Witch. It's an unusual film by Nicolas Cage standards, and as we've seen, it can be a divisive one. Still, there's a lot to learn from a movie like that, and I'd suggest seeing it for yourself at least once, and then decide where you stand on it. Anyway, I'd like to thank our viewers for listening, and I'd also like to thank our patrons for making this podcast possible.